Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lau. Thank you, Mrs. Chung. Thank you to the organizers, to the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charity Trust. It's amazing to be back in Hong Kong. It's one of my favorite cities. I spent many years in Singapore and in Asia, and I always love to come back here. It's also, I know we're going to talk about how we can make this city more prepared, more resilient to disaster. But I think it's worth, just before I start, just acknowledging how extraordinary this city is and how resilient it really is. I was here just after the typhoon last year, and I remember, like today, like it was yesterday, this headline in the South China Morning Post. It said, "Strongest typhoon on record hits Hong Kong, days of inconvenience expected." That is unbelievable, right? No fatalities, no disruption to business, basically. This city kept on, was very resilient, and I think there's something to be said for that. Of course, in order to continue to be resilient, you have to continue to ask the difficult questions. You have to continue to learn. And that's what this conference is about, so I certainly applaud that. My talk this morning will be really externally focused. I'm here to bring the international perspective, and I look forward to the rest of the day learning about the best practices in Hong Kong, in the region, so that I can bring them to the cities and the network and the rest of the world. So with that, let me just start a little bit and talk about my experience with resilience. It's a very personal one. As Dr. Lau said, I was the Deputy Commissioner of Emergency Management in New York City between 1998 and 2005. And in the late 90s, we were very concerned with hurricanes or typhoons. New York City is one of the most vulnerable cities in the world to hurricanes and typhoons. It has to do with the fact that it's an extremely coastal city. It has 800 miles of coastline throughout New York City, with some of the densest, lowest lying areas in the country. And the right angle of the harbor, it's called the New York Bight, helps the storm surge funnel into this harbor that you can see here. It's tremendously at risk. And so in the late 90s, the thing that we were most concerned with was hurricanes. Of course, then 2 planes flew into 2 buildings. And after that, as Dr. Lau said, American 587 crashed into Queens. This would have been the biggest disaster in anyone's career. A jumbo jet goes down in a residential neighborhood. But of course we had 9/11, so it didn't look that bad at the time. And then anthrax letters were delivered to a number of people, including Tom Brokaw, and this was very good anthrax, so extremely advanced biological agent in an envelope. We had the great blackout of 2003, which lasted 4 or 5 days. And after that, we had the crash of the financial economy, which is the major sector for New York City. And only in 2012 do we have Hurricane and Superstorm Sandy. That's the thing, is that cities rarely know what the next thing that's going to hit them is. You think you know. If you're living in Hong Kong, you have to prepare for typhoons because you will have them, or you have to prepare for pandemics. But the next thing that happens, we don't know. And so what resilience tries to do is say, how can we make the city stronger, more livable, sustainable, and resilient so that we're prepared for whatever the next thing is that comes. I mean, it's this fact that the world is urbanizing, and you see it in Asia as much as any place, and that cities, because of where they sit, because of the fragility of the populations, because of the rapid urbanization, and because of the lack of infrastructure, continue to be more and more at risk. And whether that's from hurricanes, as we saw in Puerto Rico, in Hurricane Maria, or earthquakes. The mayor of Mexico City actually was in my office the day before this earthquake, talking about earthquake preparedness. And the city did much, much better than a massive similar earthquake in 1986, where 50,000 people died. Only 6,000 or 7,000 people died in this earthquake. but still, schools should never collapse on top of children, and the city must and continue to do better. And of course, South Africa, Cape Town, almost ran out of water, came very, very close to what they call 0 day, where the city would run, for all intents and purposes, run out of water, which exposed a real, as bad as this was as a technical problem, where to get the water from, this is also a societal problem that exposed the difference between the very rich who would survive this event and the much poorer who would have a much, much more difficult time. And so what resilience asks is, how do we envision a city that is strong, that can respond to any of these? It's not just a technical question, it's a broader societal and management question. And so this is how we at 100 Resilient Cities think about urban resilience. I mean, this is chapter and verse, but quite simply, it's about a city's ability to survive disaster. But don't just think about it as the sudden disasters, the acute shocks, earthquake, hurricane, typhoon, tornado, terrorism, those acute events, but also think about it as as slow burn, low impact, but long-term events we call the chronic stresses. Long-term food, water, and energy shortages, high levels of crime and violence, eroding social cohesion, or shifting macroeconomic trends that disadvantage a city. Many of our cities are port cities in our network of 100 cities. They're port cities that have a lot to do with global shipping. Rotterdam in the Netherlands is one of them. What happens when 3D printing starts to change the way we produce, ship, and consume goods? That will have profound impact on the cities that have a port presence, that rely on the port and shipping for a big part of their economy. How do we think about resilience in that way? And really what resilience is about is understanding the weaker a city is because of these chronic stresses. You see in the background, this is an image of homelessness in the US. The weaker the city is because of these stresses, the less able it is to respond to the shocks when they actually happen. And so thinking about those things together, both as risk profiles on the one hand, and as opportunities on the other, and I'll talk about that. So what makes a resilient city? It's all of the things. Of course, it's good disaster response and emergency response, but it's a city that has a cohesive communities where neighbors check on neighbors. It's a diverse middle-class economy with high levels of equity. It's good infrastructure, and it's strong governance with a broad range of stakeholders at the table. All of these capacities, these capabilities, help cities survive and thrive in the face of disaster. This is really what resilient cities are about. And to give you an example of that, I'm going to talk about it on the risk side first, because I think this is both a risk profile and an opportunity. Let me talk about the case study of New Orleans, right? New Orleans was hit by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. That is a story in part about how big the storm was. It was a Cat 5 or a strong Cat 4 storm. New Orleans has an average height of -6 feet below sea level, so it's a very low city protected by dikes and levees. Those dikes failed, and you can see massive flooding in New Orleans. That's part of the story. But after the storm, what did we see? We saw rioting and looting. We saw law enforcement unable to control the populations. We saw people leaving the city and never coming back. We saw lots and lots of other, what we call downstream effects. That has everything to do with those other stresses I talked about. The government was a corrupt, ineffective government. The people didn't trust the political leaders. There were big areas. This is called an area called the Lower Ninth Ward, which was very famous in New Orleans. There are big areas that had high levels of poverty and isolation. It was a city of rich and poor, where life chances were bad. That had everything to do. This is not a rhetorical device. This is not academics talking about what may or may not make resilience or fragility. This had everything to do with the risk profile in New Orleans, as much as the storm, the infrastructure, and the emergency response. That's what resilient cities are about. They're about improving and strengthening the city in good times so you have the capacity to withstand the disaster. It's also about an opportunity, and here I give you this story of Paris. And before I talk about Paris, and it's a very topical one, it's a very timely one because Paris is going through a heat wave now. Before I talk about Paris, let me talk a little bit about 100 Resilient Cities. We're a network of 100 cities. We help them hire a chief resilience officer. We help them do a resilience strategy. We connect them in a peer-to-peer network so they can learn and talk to each other. And we connect them to partners so that they can have access to outside partners. And Paris applied to our program in 2014. And they wanted to talk about air pollution, heat waves, and flooding. The mayor of Paris, as you may know, Anne Hidalgo, is a very environmentally focused mayor, and she wanted to talk about climate and climate change in particular. But then, of course, 2015 happens. You have 2 terrorist attacks and a refugee crisis. And so the question is how to think about the environmental challenges, the opportunities, and the risks associated with them at the same time as you talk about these social challenges of cohesion, of security, and so on. And so this is the Chief Resilience Officer of Paris, a guy named Sébastien Maire, working and gathering an interdisciplinary, intersectoral group of stakeholders together to work on the Paris Resilience Strategy, which was published in 2017. It had 35 actions. It was not a long-term plan, but a mid-range plan, an 8-year timeline around those 6 challenges that you can see: equity, safety, climate, air quality, of course, flooding, and social cohesion. And one of the key issues and programs and initiatives that the city identified was this idea of green space, something called the Oasis Schoolyard. Paris is incredibly densely urbanized. It has some of the lowest areas of public space, of green public space, for any world capital, if you can believe that. And it was looking for places to house green infrastructure. And it identified 561 interior schoolyards, like you see here, that the city controlled, that ultimately made up close to 700 acres of land within the city. And so the challenge is, how do you think about, on the one hand, the climate threats with the social threats? How do you design an intervention that makes the city stronger, more livable, sustainable, and resilient with this asset? And so you take what was just a concrete interior schoolyard, and you start to green it. And you put first light colored substrate and green roofs. And this is a climate adaptation to break the urban heat island in Paris, to reduce temperatures in the inner city, and ultimately to save lives. So that's the first thing. But then you add permeable surfaces and rainwater capture so that you reduce the impact of flooding and runoff into the sewers when you have heavy rains. And then you open these up to the communities on weekends and non-school periods so that the newest residents, the immigrants, people who might be marginalized or who might have a place where they learn how to be more Parisian, more European, more French, right? This hopefully will reduce radicalization. And so this is the kind of what we call the resilience dividend. Not only do you start to address the effects of climate change by improving temperature levels and breaking the urban heat island, and by reducing localized flooding risk, but you also open this school, this pleasant, green, verdant location to the community so that they become less radicalized and more integrated. And that hopefully improves social cohesion. That's what the resilience dividend is all about. And it, in a year that was very tough for the Paris mayor, you see her on the right-hand side and her deputy mayor for climate on the left, this was an incredibly popular initiative. Global recognition through many of the local network, of the city networks. We have project replication. It was awarded an innovation award from the EU. And they are going to expand this. We did 3 pilots in 2018, 40 schools targeted for this year, and all schools by 2040. And it takes very little extra money because there's already money in the budget to do school maintenance. So it's really a win-win. It's just a question of thinking in a more integrated and interdisciplinary way. And ultimately, that's the kind of thing, if cities are going to make the most out of building the infrastructure that they need to build, if they build it in more integrated, inclusive, and innovative ways, they can make themselves stronger and more resilient to whatever the next thing that happens. Paris is only one of 100 cities in the network. Here are some of the other strategies. They're all online. It's a great example of the way cities are beginning to learn from each other and push the boundaries. And I look forward to your questions after the next speaker. Thank you very much.